I am so delighted to welcome our first speaker, Scott Garner, who some of you have seen this past week in the lab, is an amazing artist and technologist who does just magical things with both physical and digital technology and craft and ideas. Scott is going to tell us today a little bit more. I will let Scott talk more about his work, but I just wanted to mention earlier this year, Pioneer Square in Portland brought in this temporary sort of geodesic dome and invited us to create something that was art and technology around it. We had a couple projects, and the main one was Scott's really beautiful augmented reality interactive bouquet of flowers, essentially. Those of you in the lab and saw the big magnet of flowers will learn a lot more about it. Today, Scott's going to tell us about how he made the project and what sorts of techniques and tools would be useful. And hopefully it invites some of you to sort of come participate and create something similar along with our projects over the years. So welcome, Scott. I'm so excited to have you here. I will quietly step away, but I'll be here lurking.
Okay. Thanks, Nandini. So I will push some buttons on the stream and add this. And so, hello. So as Nandini said, I'm Scott Garner. I'm sure many of you have already heard from me, whether it was, from the initial workshops and talks we've done this week, or from Winter Lights Festival, or some of the stuff we did last year, or for the Dome. And so I've definitely been around. And I apologize in advance for those of you that have already heard me talk about some of this stuff. In fact, I was realizing as I was preparing this talk, like maybe I've talked a bit too much about older projects, and I should talk about something new. So my standard intro all the time is I'm a multidisciplinary artist working to unite technical design and craft skills into a cohesive creative voice. And I think I want to stress that basically every time I say it, even though you've already heard it 100 times, because it took me so long to get to the point that I could do that I could, me as a person, comfortably combine all these interests of like music and technology and circuitry and programming and visual art and kind of interactive participatory artwork. All of those things is kind of what I've really been focused on for years and years and years. And so the kind of focus point where all of that has come together, I think aligns really well with the theme of enchanted objects, because so much of the work that I do involves kind of a hybrid physical digital experience where we have real objects in the world made of real things, and then some sort of digital layer. And sometimes that's totally invisible. And I've definitely talked about that work in the past, and we'll poke through a few projects like that this morning before we dive into the Dome. And some of it, the technology is incorporated in a visible way, but hopefully in kind of a magical way. And so just before we dive into the Dome, again, if you want more details on some of these projects, even just the talk I gave yesterday should be on the SETI YouTube channel to talk about some of the sensors that I've used in projects. I think earlier this year for Winter Lights, also on the SETI YouTube channel, you'll find me kind of talking about other sorts of things that I make. So if you'd like to look at my work, you can go to scottmadethis.net. Again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this part of it because I really have talked about some of these things a whole lot. But you can kind of scroll through here and see over time what I've worked on, like early on, simple animations and music, getting into more kind of interactive things, starting to have some things with circuitry like the piano gloves, which I mentioned yesterday, things like still life, which I mentioned yesterday, and the beatbox. And the beatbox for me was really one of the first times that I really was focused on, okay, can I make a kind of a magical experience with technology that was invisible? And I'm sure many of you have seen this repeatedly, so I apologize. And I'm honestly not even sure if you'll be able to hear the sound for it. So I'll just encourage you to go look at it. The idea basically was that people could interface with this thing that appeared to be, a totally inert object and have it play music. And so check that out if you haven't already seen it. Check out some of these other projects. But I thought today, just to try something a little different, rather than rehashing old projects, I would talk about a more recent project. And it was actually as of just a few months ago, as Nandini mentioned, we had an opportunity to do this project as part of the Welcome Dome, where I created an AR experience that used the dome as the anchor. And so I'm going to pop back to my pretend slides, where I like to pretend Markdown is just slides, and scroll down a little bit and just give you a little bit of context. And so the idea of the Welcome Dome, there's a link here. The dome is no longer in the square, so some of this information is a bit out of date. But the idea was, in Pioneer Courthouse Square, which is pretty central in downtown Portland. There's a big open space in front of the courthouse, and it's used for all kinds of like performances and community activities, and really is kind of a hub for in a lot of ways for things going on in downtown Portland. And the idea of this organization putting together the Welcome Dome was almost like a pop-up event space for community events. And they did all kinds of things. They had podcast recordings, and they had dance sessions and yoga classes and all kinds of things that happened in a geodesic dome. And I think I probably somewhere have a hopefully helpful picture of the dome. Yeah, so here's a photo of the dome. So it may look small from the outside and small in this photo, but it was actually quite large. It was a pretty big space to inhabit. And initially, you can see there was this open window on the front, but we'll talk more about that. But I just want to give you this initial image to kind of like frame the context of what we're talking about. And so, again, as Nandini mentioned, SETI had the opportunity to create some interactive experiences there. And really, it just kind of started with that, with the idea of like, hey, this dome is here. There's going to be all these sort of community activities, community pop-up activities. Would SETI, what would SETI like to do in terms of an interactive experience? And so along with a group of other people that worked on this project, definitely was not just me, we kind of came up with some ideas and themes of how we would want to approach the dome. There was some really interesting interactive projections that went on the inside of the dome, and some sort of experimental kind of sound collage pieces to build out that space. But tonight, I'm just going to talk about the part that I worked on, which was the AR experience using the dome as an anchor. And we'll talk more about what I mean by that. But if you've caught any of the workshops this week, you've seen Stephen Christian do a few AR workshops around kind of more smaller, more handheld objects. So he talked about AR stickers and AR bookmarks. And I'm sure you've seen AR experiences at larger scales, maybe posters, even billboards. And I think an interesting thing to point out is, in our definition, SETI's definition kind of what an enchanted object is, we include this, like adding an augmented layer or kind of this digital layer on top of the environment or on top of handheld smaller objects, all the way down to just a sticker or a button, all the way up to full-scale buildings. We view that as a kind of a form of enchanted technology and enchanted objects. And so the goal I wanted, without even knowing exactly what I was going to do, what the story was, and I'll kind of talk about that process today, we talked about like, well, what if we did an AR experience based on the dome or at the dome? And to just draw a distinction, there's lots of different kinds of location-based AR, but I wanted the dome to be part of it. So in other words, not just that you're standing at the dome and then you see something on the floor or in the corner or a little character pops up over here. I really wanted the dome to be kind of physically involved, because that is a really big part of my work. I don't really like to do things that are purely digital. And I actually do kind of like to do things that are purely physical, just fabrication and craft, but I actually am not very excited about purely digital projects. I like there to be some tangible part, and I like there to be some story around it as well. So moving forward a little bit, I thought I would just show, kind of show the end of it first. Wait, that's not even the right link. I'm in some confused state here where I'm not seeing the actual document. We'll do some live troubleshooting. Is this better? There we go. So I'm just going to show you, this is my documentation. If you check out the SETI webpage at seti.institute, there's a video that Hillary cut that is a broader video of the whole event and what was going on there. So I'm just going to show you the video that I made to kind of express the piece that I was working on. Again, unfortunately, I'm not totally sure if I will have, maybe I'll try that. If you'll bear with me for one moment, maybe I actually can, let's see, add just a Google page. It seems like I can't. Okay, that's okay. We're still figuring out StreamYard in terms of audio. If we share Chrome tabs, you can play audio, but if you bounce back and forth the Windows, I don't think you can. But you'll at least see it, and then you can, maybe we'll look at it later and play it with audio. But this little video, I'll kind of narrate it as we go along. So again, the idea was to take this physical dome existing in physical space in a real environment and give a place for people to come and gather and hopefully have kind of a magical experience. And so the idea was that you could use your device, or we had some devices on hand. You could activate an anchored AR experience, and I'll kind of talk about what that means a little more soon, and see the whole dome covered in flowers. And then actually, you probably can't hear this right now, but that's okay. You could tap on the dome through the lens of your phone or of the tablet and see those flowers animate and play music. And so I just kind of wanted to start with the ending first, so you could kind of see, I gave you the background just now. I'm showing you the, kind of where I arrived at the end of it, but the journey along the way is what I'm going to focus on today. So the thing I'm really going to focus on today is something I haven't really done much of before, at least in kind of the context of a talk, and certainly not with SETI. Kind of like get into the process and look at some of the tools, and maybe even get a little technical about like some of the tools and processes I use. Because, a lot of the other talks I've been doing are kind of high level and introductory. And so this is definitely not a lesson on how to do this. I'm not even sure that I like all of these technologies, and that will be part of what I want to talk about. Is there's always compromise and some constraints in what this kind of work. But yeah, hopefully this will be an interesting little overview of this project. That really was a rewarding project. I mean, it was interesting. It was honestly a little frantic to get it done in time because it was a short timeline, but to actually see people use it, see kids enjoy it, all of that was really lovely. And so I just want to talk kind of very high level, and then we'll dive into these on like, what does it take to make a project like this happen? So you just saw that thing, you saw the dome, you saw the iPads, you saw the people. How do you get there? And so the main thing that I want to talk about as the starting point is, at least for my creative work, and I think this is pretty common, is certainly with other groups and artists that I've worked with in the past, is you kind of need a story. But that story has some constraints, right? You're on rails a little bit. Usually you aren't just opening with sort of, oh, the sky's the limit, can do anything we want. Like, that's true to a certain extent, but there are some constraints. In this case, there's a physical giant dome, and part of dealing with that dome is a constraint. It's located in downtown Portland. There's kind of a constraint there. There's a short timeline. It's kind of a constraint. It might be rainy some days or cloudy or sunny. Those are all constraints as well. People may or may not own cell phones, or they may have older cell phones. That's a constraint. So, with all of those things kind of percolating in my mind, I try to push them aside. I keep them floating around, but the important thing is the story, right? Like the experience that people have when they come up to the dome. I don't want them to have to care if, it didn't work very well on a certain version of Android and I had to work really hard to make that work. Or I don't want them to care if like, oh, we had to really figure some things out in terms of the Wi-Fi or stuff like that. Like, that's not their problem. And it's a real bummer when you try to have someone come up and enjoy something, and then you have issues, like the Wi-Fi is not working or the networking. It really breaks that kind of magical experience. So I have those things floating around in my mind, those technical constraints and those technical issues. But the thing that you can't start with those. I mean, you can, but I think it doesn't necessarily lead to the best projects, because what we're working towards is a magical experience for people, a story and an activity, and the technology is there to support that and facilitate it. But for most of the work I do, with some exceptions, the technology is not what is actually the point. It's not actually at the forefront. It's what we can do with the technology that is interesting. And so in this case, again, I mentioned those constraints, and I started thinking about the story, and we'll talk about how I went about that. But I also had to revise that story, and that's another important consideration here. So then, parallel to that, it does not necessarily. It's a little bit before, it's a little bit after, but it's largely parallel. There's also, as the story develops and as the ideas develop and as the concepts of like, well, what will people do? What will the activities be? There's the narrative. Parallel to that narrative is like, well, what are the tools we need to do that? Like, what are the technologies that are available? What are the platforms? What is the hardware? What is the software? Like, what are the options, even when we decide that we want to do a certain thing like AR? Like, what's the best way to go about that? And it can be hard. And very often the things I do are very much, I don't know, this is the silly term. It's the term that comes to mind. Forgive me for using it, but kind of like the cutting edge. And I only mean that not in like some flattering sense, but I'm usually working with very new technologies. And you might even say sort of like infantile in some ways. Maybe that's too far in the other direction, but sort of like some of these technologies are brand new. Some of them are kind of half-baked. Some of them don't actually work very well. And so that's very frequently a constraint that I have, is that these, the tools and platforms might not be fully mature, or they might not work exactly the way that I want them to. And very often I'm admittedly trying to make technology do things that it wasn't necessarily designed to do. But, that's part of this process. And when I say part of the process, what the process actually is, what so much of the work actually is is prototypes and experiments, and you iterate and you try something and you do a little prototype, you test it, you learn something from it, you try it again. And so maybe one of the most important things to say about this project, I showed you the end result. That is not what was in my mind when I started. And that is very frequently the case with creative work. I'm sure there are certain people that can just conceptualize an idea, and then at the end of the project, they're just like, here it is. It's exactly what it was in my brain. I personally think that's probably pretty rare. And there's a book by David Lynch. I think it's called Catching the Big Fish, the film director David Lynch. And I don't remember the exact numbers he says, but he talks about how from when he first is starting to imagine a movie to when he is actually, the movie's done and edited and is on a screen, he feels good. And I'm going to get these numbers wrong, but it's something like he feels like he's done a great job if it's even like 40% of what he originally imagined, right? It changes that much. And I would even say in some cases, 40% is really ambitious. In many cases, the thing I end up with is so distant from the thing that I thought the initial idea was, that in terms of like the execution, it can almost be unrecognizable in some cases. However, I will say the kernel of the story did maintain through all of this. That is something that I was able to hang on through this. And then just to add to that, this isn't a linear process. It's not step 1, step 2, step 3. You iterate through all of these, and you may find, and I did, that, I come up with a story that I like, and it's great. I got the story. I choose the technology. Oh, I know what I'm going to do. This is great. I've got it figured out. And then I actually do the prototype and testing, and it doesn't work. And it doesn't work either because of a technology limitation, or it doesn't work because the kind of user experience I was imagining, once you try it in the real world, doesn't actually feel good, or isn't actually fun, or something is missing. And that's fine, because then I go to the next step and it just tells me like, actually, I'm going to go back and revisit the idea for the story, or actually, I'm going to go back and change my idea of the technology a little bit. And I will say for myself, I've talked pretty frequently about how much I work with the Children's Museum in Pittsburgh, and how it's one of my favorite contexts to work in, because it's just a requirement there to like make a prototype, put it on the floor, see the kids use it, and then recognize, see what works and see what doesn't, and then try to solve those problems. And very often it's illuminating to see, especially in those contexts where I put something on the floor, the kids play with it in a way that I didn't even imagine, or they do something that I didn't expect, and then that comes back and informs the story. And so it really is a cyclical process. And that's true for me, whether I'm working individually, which is definitely my preference of how to work, or if I'm working through teams or on jobs. It really is this process of testing and experimenting and figuring out what works. And I will say that's not how all people work. It's not how all companies work. It's definitely not the only way to make things, because especially if you're imagining like a big commercial design project or something like that, they may not build into the schedule the ability to do that, or it may be limited. And so it's not the only way the world works, but it's definitely how my creative process works. So to kind of just hit these bullet points a little bit and talk about my process on them. So the first one was kind of creating the story. And for me, these are things that are hard to talk about logically, or have, I'm going to sit here and rationally explain these things to you. Creativity for me is not a rational process usually. And often the more rational it is, kind of like the less creative it is, for me, at least. And I've definitely heard other people describe similar concerns where, it's not a 1, 2, 3 process. It's not, step 1 through 10 and you just check off the list and you've created a story, or you've created an experience. It doesn't really work that way. And so what I usually start to do is, as I mentioned, like start to have all those constraints just swimming around in my head. Like, okay, it's a dome, it's in Portland, it's downtown. We want people to go inside of it and outside of it. And so, and again, I was talking to some other SETI members that were working, or SETI people and artists about what was going on inside the dome and outside the dome, and kind of what's the big picture and the big story. And one of the things that really struck me early on was this idea of Portland as it's Rose City. It was near the time of the Rose Parade. And I was just starting to really think about it. Like, what if we thought of this as like a giant egg or a giant seed? And actually the very first thing I was thinking was an egg, and like, oh, maybe it's a giant egg, and the egg hatches open, and then something comes out of the top of this giant, ridiculous dome. And just to like put that into context, with a bit of visuals, like you can imagine this big white hemisphere in Pioneer Square would open and then some animal would come out. I don't know. And I didn't know. And that's kind of the point, is like, I wasn't sure then. I was just building a story. Like, I didn't know exactly what would happen. But the more I thought about it, I think the egg was maybe my first idea, but then I started leaning more towards seed, because the idea of the seed fit a little more with like Portland's identity as Rose City. And it's like such a lush, beautiful place. And the Rose Garden's gorgeous, and Forest Park is gorgeous. And there's all these beautiful outdoor spaces. And so finding ways to incorporate that. And certainly I should also mention some of the other artists were interested in that realm too, and had work in that realm and work with like footage and photography of plant life and botany and all of this kind of like a beautiful, lush environment that we have in the Pacific Northwest. So after kind of thinking about that in like the really vague, abstract context, I started to anchor it a little bit more, like, okay, but what really is going to happen? Like, what do I really want to happen here? And so the first vision in my head, after the very vague idea of the egg, when I started thinking about it more seriously, was like, okay, well, maybe visitors can come up and they'll look through their phones and they'll see the dome. And then the dome somehow is going to erupt like a plant is growing out of the top. And I had this vision in my mind of this 10-story tall plant that was going to grow. And then I started thinking like, oh, what if it was like a still life, like a Dutch still life, and all these plants would sort of bloom and explode from the top. And we'll look at some of these examples. I realize this moment is not very visual, and I apologize for that, but we'll get to that part. And then I started thinking about, so that's the visual part, that's the experience part, but I still was thinking about the story and the narrative around it, and thinking about, wanting a deeper meaning or deeper story. So I really started thinking about cultivation, what it takes to nurture something and care for something in the very literal sense, obviously with plant life, of having your home plants, and you're watering your plants and you're making sure they get sunlight and things like that, and being very careful about that, but also in like a broader sense of our communities and our shared spaces and our parks and our schools and all of these things, like cultivating our own garden. And I actually, the title of the piece, Let Us Cultivate Our Garden, and I'm sure I will mention more about this, came from, it's one of the last lines of the book Candide by Voltaire. And I won't go into the full meaning of it in the story, but basically this character's been through absolute insanity. So the character's been all around the world, just complete chaos, just an incredibly chaotic life. But their core principle is kind of optimism, and that the world is the best that it can possibly be. But by the time they get to the end, they're talking to another character, and they're kind of out in the garden working, and the other character is sort of talking about these big ideas. And Candide is like, you know what? Let's just cultivate our garden. And I think that was my interpretation, at least, was Candide meant that in the literal sense, like, hey, let's just focus on what's in front of us, but also like, this is our garden, let's focus on what we have control over. Like, let's cultivate our little sphere of the world, and, do what we can to make that work well, and not feel paralyzed by these huge issues that maybe we don't have as much agency in. That doesn't mean you ignore those issues, but like you try to be realistic about what you can actually accomplish sort of in your own realm, your own family, your own circle of friends, your own community, things like that. So parallel to this, these are parallel processes. I'm thinking about technology, and I'm thinking about tools. And so I will just come out and say AR platforms are mostly terrible. And I think if you've heard me talk about this, you've probably heard these words coming out of my mouth. And one of the things I really have a hard time with is so much of what is going on in AR is extremely tied to like individual corporations and individual brands, right? It's not the same way that the early internet was, where you had HTTP and FTP and Gopher and Usenet and these other things that were sort of like, they're just open standards that exist in the world for people to use and take advantage of. They don't belong to anybody. And in fact, the first company in my mind that came by and sort of like ruined the party for everybody was America Online, because America Online kind of came along with their instant message client, pushed that, it became very dominant. There's obviously reasons people were drawn to that. I mean, I'm realistic about that, but it kind of pushed to the side some of these other technologies that already existed for chatting and talking, like Internet Relay Chat. IRC was also a technology that existed at that time that was kind of brushed to the wayside. And what is a really funny, weird thing is Slack and Discord and even the Twitch chat to a certain extent is kind of very heavily based and inspired to an extreme degree by internet relay chat, it's just not open anymore. Now it's tied to these companies and you have to pay monthly fees, and it sucks. It's a step in the wrong direction, in my opinion. And unfortunately, we're moving into this future where AR, I can almost guarantee you that AR is going to be an important part of our everyday lives, the way that our phones are important parts of our everyday lives now. And it's going to be more and more and more corporate. And it's a bummer. And when you look at the tools that are available now, the tools are, it's Facebook's Spark AR, or maybe it's Meta at this point, or it's Snapchat's Lens Studio, or Apple has AR Kit, Google has AR Core, right? All of these technologies come with a company name, and it's a bummer because all those companies are, they're competing with each other. They are drawing lines in the sand for this like future AR turf war that is coming in the future. And it's just unfortunate. And of course they all want money, and some of these platforms are very expensive. And so at a very high level, just to draw a line kind of in three categories here, we do have the app-based AR experiences of existing apps like Facebook or Adobe Aero or Snapchat, with their sort of like, hey, if you download our apps, you can do these things. So there's that realm. Then there's the tools that are for creators of apps, you know, app developers of their own. And that includes AR Kit and AR Core, which I'm sure those other companies use to some extent. Or there's companies like Unity that have built something called AR Foundation that lets you use both of those, which I quite like. But the issue then is you have to build and deploy an app. You have to, not only do you all do all the work to make it, then you have to build it and get it on the store, on the Apple Store or on the Google Store. And then comes the hardest part. You have to get people to care enough to download an app. And my experience with these like multi-user in-person interactive experiences, this is my own experience, and I've heard it from other people working in this realm. People don't want to download apps for a 5-minute experience, right? Like it's a lot to ask. Like people just don't want to you're asking someone to like, okay, I got to take my phone, I got to go somewhere, I have to download it, I have to wait for it to install. Maybe the Wi-Fi is bad, the cell signal's bad. I have to open your app. Oh, maybe I have to sign up for an account, whatever. It's just, there's so much friction there that for a short experience, in my, you know, in the times I've done this in other contexts, people don't want to do that. It's just, and it's understandable. Like it's a lot to ask of someone for every 5-minute little thing to download some other app to engage with it. And so the question over here is, why Eighth Wall? Well, Eighth Wall is an AR platform that is web-based. And they use the term web AR here. And I kind of take issue with that because web AR implies that that's a standard that they're adhering to, but it's not. It's their own platform and it's their own tool set. They were recently purchased by Niantic, but they're still, you know, that's still a corporate interest. And unfortunately, there are a few other competitors, but this is kind of your best option for web AR. If you want to do AR in a web browser and not make people download an app, it's maybe the best option we have right now. There's some competitors, but they also have limitations, and it's expensive. It unfortunately is expensive. Like you can look at these plans here and see, honestly, when we started, these other plans didn't exist, but this is $100 a month just to develop with it. And then if you want to like create something that's at all commercial, you're looking at another $1,200 a month, $3,000 a month, $5,000 a month. It's not made for humans, right? This is made for like brands and agencies. And I will say when Niantic purchased it, they started making some changes that I think are good. And they at least have this starter plan. I still think it's ridiculous. I still think you should always be able to start for free, but I will at least say this is a step in the right direction. But it's unfortunate. It's a real bummer. But it remains like, if you want frictionless augmented reality experiences in a web browser, it's kind of the best option. And actually, if you watched and you should, the talk that we did about the Project Freedom Constellations earlier this year, I believe, also on the SETI channel, you can see an amazing project that was done by Invisible Thread and a few other groups that worked together to create this really large-scale AR experience around youth incarceration. The project was fantastic. The execution was really amazing. The way they brought everybody in to work on it was amazing. The part that sucks is the monetization. And I'm sure anyone listening to this knows that this is just the way the world is trending, and everybody has a monthly fee, and it's really depressing. And my only hope is like, yeah, I'm hoping Niantic will maybe reconsider this in the near future. But I mean, given that, it's a little hard for me to recommend, honestly. Like here at SETI, we're going to talk about Eighth Wall and we'll look at it a little bit, but it's hard to recommend because of this cost. But for what we wanted to accomplish, we decided, well, we want to give people the best experience. It's not the best experience if they have to download an app. So we just decided early on, like, okay, it's worth it for us to pay this price because we want to create these experiences for people. And so I know it's a lot to talk about, and I don't want to go too deeply into it, but hopefully you can see just there's almost like ideological issues in addition to the financial and technological issues when we're making these choices, even almost to a certain point, depending on the company, certain ethical issues even. Like I personally would have a really hard time making something with Spark AR because of the way I feel about Facebook and Meta. Does that mean I think it's like fundamentally an evil platform? No. And I think it can be useful for people to learn and experiment, but it raises some questions, I would say. So that is the AR tool. That's the actual tool that is going to take some sort of pre-authored digital content and put it in the world. And if you go check out this site, you can click try an AR and you can put this cute little Yeti on your floor and they will walk around your house. But it's yeah, anyway, I have more to say on that I'll say at another time, but you should play with it because it's fun and it works well. It's just the pricing is outrageous. Now, another thing that really bothers me about Eighth Wall, but I will talk about a tool that I really like a lot and that I've used for many years is Three.js. And Three.js is a totally open source, totally free platform for doing real-time hardware accelerated 3D graphics in a web browser. And there are some alternatives to Three.js now, but I've been using it for over 10 years. I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of the group that works on it and maintains it. Like I admire them and I admire the work that they do. I think they've done a great job on kind of like onboarding and teaching, but they've also made this tool available for like really robust, high-end professional experiences. There've been some amazing experiences, especially early on, like with real-time interactive music videos in a web browser. I've done some things in that realm. Real-time virtual reality experiences in a web browser is something else I've done. And maybe when David Lobser is here in a few weeks, we'll talk about some of the work we've done in that realm. But it's an incredible tool set. It is totally free. All the source code is there. All the examples are there. This is the kind of project I like and I feel good about supporting. And it makes me that much more irritated when Eighth Wall wants to charge you $100 a month just for their AR piece, right? They're only doing one small part of the work when all of the graphics work is actually done by these open tools. So forgive the rant, but I just want to say, like, choosing tools and technology is not, it's part of it's about budget. Part of it's about like skill ceiling and learning curve and complexity and cost of the equipment. But part of it really is like, can you feel good about using these tools? I will say I've always felt good about using Three.js. I've used it for so many years and it really is a great project. And for anybody interested in doing like really lush, especially if you're a programmer, because this is kind of a development platform, framework, whatever terms you want to use, that is mostly code driven. So if that's the kind of person you are and you think more in terms of programming than sort of like visual authoring of things, this can be a great tool to get in that. And they have lots of great resources to kind of onboard you. They've got some books that are handy. But honestly, I mean, if you're a person that enjoys books, you should grab a book and enjoy it. But I think the online resources are really stellar and kind of go through the whole process, how it all works. I think they've done a really tremendous job. And so kind of it was a no-brainer for me to decide to use that for the graphics. So in other words, Eighth Wall is what is responsible, you saw the dome, for like giving me a sense of the physical world to draw. So I knew where to draw, but it's actually Three.js is the tool that I use to draw. And then as far as what I draw and how I drew it and how I made the flowers, I had this crazy idea that maybe I sort of regretted a little bit, but rather than just using photographs of flowers or 3D modeling flowers in Maya or some existing software, I decided, well, I think I want to try to design a generative botany system that will grow flowers. Like I want to just do this from first principles. I want to look at flowers and plants and plant life and foliage and just go on walks in my neighborhood, go on walks in Forest Park and just look at the flowers and think about the geometry of flowers. And then my goal was, and I think I did okay with this goal, was to look at that and be like, well, can I come up with a system to describe a simple system a reductive system. It's a simple system. It's not like a real, like, it's definitely not a botany tool or a scientific tool, but a tool that can kind of approximate these flowers in a way that is, you know, kind of evokes the beauty and complexity and lushness of these real living things, but do it in a way that I'm kind of like building systems to build it. And if you've heard me talk about the way I like to make music, I like to make things that make music. And so I was trying to do that with generative visuals as well. So in other words, I wanted to make things that made visuals. And then as far as talking about what my process was, and this I will go into in more detail. And thank you for bearing with me on this very text and talking heavy part. We'll actually look at some tests and even look at a little bit of code. We probably won't go super deep into that today, but you can just see what the project looks like, because it got pretty complex, mainly due to the generative botany part. But I kind of had three sort of tracks I was focused on as I was doing the prototyping and experiment. So I was working just in a web browser with Three.js, just building the tools, right? Like not even thinking about AR, not thinking about anything beyond what I just told you about generative geometry. Like, can I make botany? Can I make botanical entities with math, basically? And I spent a lot of time focused on that. I also spent a lot of time doing tests in the physical world. So I built some paper models. You'll see they're very silly. I did very small scale AR tests, just like around my apartment or at a coffee shop, like tests that would test the technology, but at a much smaller scale. And then of course, I have to be concerned about this giant dome that exists in space. So I frequently was visiting the dome, frequently taking measurements, building 3D models, doing LiDAR scans of the dome to have kind of a reference point for it. And so it took all of that all of these are things that I was doing at different times on different days. And as I said, in a relatively abbreviated amount of time to make this happen. And then ending with the last point on that list, the rinse and repeat, like I had so many points where I thought I knew what I was going to do. And then I tried it and it didn't work the way that I wanted it to. So my first thought, as I mentioned, like once I really started thinking about it hard, was like, okay, everybody's going to come up to this dome and it's going to be a seed and there's going to be a 10-story tall bouquet is going to bloom out of this. And I tested that and I made it. I did the work to make it and I tested it. And then during one of the site visits, you know, I had a few other people did some tests and it didn't work as well as I wanted it to. And I could have stopped there and been like, it's good enough. You know, it's going to be okay. It'll be fine. Maybe I'll make it smaller or whatever. But I just, you know, part of my process is this iterative process. And I decided like that just wouldn't give the feel that I wanted, right? Like both in terms of just my confidence in the ability of the software to do the AR tracking well, but also just in my feeling of like what it would be like a human to come up to this thing and look at it. It just didn't feel right to me. So then I decided like, okay, well, maybe I'll put flowers on the dome instead. And the dome will be almost this surface that all these flowers grow on. And that'll be fun and it'll be great, right? And so I did that and I tested it and I really did like the effect and I was pleased with sort of the visual effect of it, but it just seemed a little boring, right? Like you saw them grow and you had this like 10 seconds of like, oh my gosh, wow, that was really interesting. I saw this appear and these flowers grew on this dome. But then the question is kind of like, then what? You know, after the first 5-10 seconds where you see the reveal, what do you do then? So then I decided like, well, maybe the flowers should be musical. You know, a lot of the work that I do ends up musical as a form of interactivity and you can kind of play with things and make little songs. And I like the ideas of the flowers sort of like singing them and almost the idea that you tapping them was kind of your way to cultivate and like show that you were nurturing a flower, almost like your tap was like sunshine and water. And when you would cultivate, you know, you would nurture that one flower, it would kind of sing a little bit and then all the flowers around it would sing. So you would only touch one flower and do something good, quote unquote, for that one flower, but the benefits of it would like spread through it. And that really, for me, connected to that bigger idea of like, you know, doing these changes in our own lives and in our own communities, and then having that spread out, you know, like have it propagate out to the world. You do your one little part, you touch your one little flower, but then the benefits of that spread out through the world. And that's basically where I stopped. And just to be totally honest with you, and this is a very common thing for projects with deadlines, I stopped because I ran out of time. Like there was more I could have done. There's more work I could have done. There's more things I could have tried. There's more experiments, things I could have done. So yeah, so it basically stopped because I didn't know what to, I ran out of time. Like, and honestly, up to the day of the opening of the event, I was still making changes. I was still like, oh, waking up early in the morning and trying to make some changes and going out to the dome and trying to tweak some things. But even at a certain point, it's like, okay, people are using this. I can't touch it anymore. So having said all of that, again, thank you for all of the nonsense rant. Hopefully some of that was interesting. But now I thought we would just kind of spend a little time first just looking at very like, these are almost like naked baby pictures. And I mean that in terms of like, you're just going to see, these are pictures and videos I was capturing as I went along in the process, not even necessarily thinking they would ever be seen. These were just sort of my little snapshots as I went along. And hopefully they'll be helpful for you to see like what this process is like, or at least for me, you know, every job's a little different. Every project's a little different, but hopefully you can kind of see like, this is how this project went for me. And so I'm going to first talk about the dome itself. You know, I talked about, well, we have this physical space and I have considerations around this physical space. And so the trajectory of that began with just visit the dome, like go out there with a ruler, walk around it, get a physical sense of what it's like how, you know, how close can you get and have it be comfortable? How far away can you get? Like, oh, how do we deal with like these white kind of pylons that are in the way? And where are these fences going to be? And you know, all of these questions like, oh, this big clear part, you know, oh, it's possible to close that. That might be good. And so just getting a sense of the space. And then one of the first things I did then was, you know, in that week or in a subsequent week was like, okay, I want to get a scan of this dome. And you can see it's a very incomplete scan. It's a pretty big dome, but I just wanted to, I had a physical sense in the world of how big the dome was. And now I just wanted to start having a sense of like in software, you know, on a computer, how big is this thing? What are the dimensions? And so this gave me an opportunity to have, it was a rough scan, but it was good as like an initial reference that I could use. And this is 3D geometry. So this was created with software called Scaniverse, which I think Niantic also bought, the company that also bought Eighth Wall. But it was a quick process. Obviously, it was very sloppy. I couldn't quite reach up to the top, even on a long tripod, but it was fine. This was enough to give me a sense of like, okay, this is the footprint of this dome, right? But as I mentioned, I typically don't like to stay purely in digital land. So one of the first things I did was build a paper model. And you can already see that the density of this, the subdivisions is probably the term you would use for this dome, this geodesic, which we don't, Nandini would do a much better job of explaining the math to you, but one way to arrive at a geodesic is to start by subdividing a simpler piece of geometry. So I believe in this case, I just started with an icosahedron with one level of subdivisions. I'm not even sure, but you can see that the subdivisions aren't the same, right? There's a lot of smaller triangles than there are here. But this was enough to give me a sense of the dome, right? And then I could hold it in my hand. So it's not me anymore like standing in front of this giant dome trying to figure out how does this even work. Now I have an object in my hand. And as soon as I have it in my hand, I can start to do things like this. I can start to do really early, simple AR experiments with just an AR marker I just scribbled. Like this, you probably can't see very well in this image, but the AR marker in this is just, I grabbed some literal markers, felt tip markers, did some scribbles. And so here I am in the SETI lab. That's where you just saw Nandini, just trying this out, just as a way to sort of like intuit what it might be at a large scale if I was a giant and I could look down on it. And this was an important part of the process, like dealing with a physical dome that is that big that you don't have constant access to. It was much easier to be like, oh, I can be in this space, or I can have a mini version of this space. So model making and things like that, even for a complex digital project, which this was a pretty complex programming project, I still needed physical help. I needed physical cues. Now, in the end, I did that initial idea, which I've alluded to, of the bouquet blooming out of the top. My initial idea was like, oh, if I do that, kind of as you see here, I don't have to worry that much about exactly matching the surface of the dome, because that's a hard thing to do in AR. And that technology is getting better, but it's actually pretty hard to perfectly match virtual content to physical real content in the world. And I was, especially with a web AR tool, a tool I'd never used before, this is my first time using Eighth Wall, I just wasn't totally confident that I would be able to do that well. And so, excuse me. So I thought, well, if I just grow it out of the top, then I don't have to care, right? Then if I just grow it out of the top, all I really have to know is how tall the dome is and basically where it is in space. And then I can just sit my flowers on top. And that's very easy. And that was much easier than the idea of I need to grow flowers on a surface. Was actually a much more complicated problem to solve. And so I had to, one of the things I had to do, and this was a bit trickier than I had anticipated, I had to actually exactly calculate the geometry of the dome. And so you saw with my paper model, as I mentioned, this was just an approximation. It was good enough for me to test with. It was a very useful model. But once I decided, okay, I actually want to be able to grow things and have them look like they're growing on the surface of the dome, I needed to spend a lot of time with some pretty fun polyhedral modeling software called Antiprism, which is just super fun. In fact, I should just like show that on screen for a moment, just because Antiprism is a favorite of mine. So you can kind of see what I'm talking about. But it's software whose whole job is to like let you play and experiment with just polyhedra, just it's a broad term, but these sort of like shapes, but these volumetric shapes that you can describe geometrically. And I'm sure Nandini will have a better definition than that. That's how my working mental model is. And I use it all the time. I use Antiprism all the time for sort of solving geometric problems or visualizing geometric problems. And so I was able to go in here, and they actually have a program. Let's see, it's probably in here somewhere. They actually have a program that is about kind of creating and simulating geodesics. And so I just spent a lot of time like reading about geodesic spheres, reading about the math. Like nobody at the dome could tell me that, oh yes, of course, this is a geodesic sphere of a classic number 2 pattern with Buckminster Fuller's stepping frequency. You know, like nobody knew that. Probably the people that made the dome didn't really know that. But I needed a pretty exact model of the dome. And so I spent a lot of time in the software kind of simulating digital versions of the dome and then kind of iterating on that until I had measurements that were quite precise. Maybe not perfectly exact, but pretty precise. So you can see that this hemisphere, this is my model that I was able to generate using Antiprism, is even as to scale, like whatever this measurement was, 56 inches or whatever, exactly matches this. So I was able to make a scale digital model to match the dome, which actually turned out to be a very important part of the process. So there's the dome part of the process, but this isn't, I'm supposed to be growing flowers, right? And as I told you, I wanted to invent this like generative botany system. So how do you do that? Like how do you go about that? And so my approach was just, as I said, walk around, look at plants, take photos of plants, and then just start making them. And so some of these first pieces, these first videos you'll see are very, very rudimentary. So it's me just writing software to kind of think about like, well, how can I approximate a plant? Like what is a simple version of this? And another thing that was important to me, I didn't want them to be static. I wanted them to grow. I wanted the plants to be able to grow, not in a botanically accurate way, but in a way that was believable, that you could see it and would feel like it was growing. So that was one of my very first tests of just making a few leaves and those leaves could grow. And I have, I don't know, probably like 50 of these videos. I just grabbed a few that seemed like maybe representative. So once I had those, then I was like, okay, if I can grow this little plant, I can probably grow a flower. And so what is a flower other than just like, it's kind of like it's a bunch of petals arranged, you know, in a certain pattern. And what is a petal? Well, a petal is kind of like a rectangle that is bent around in space. You know, it's sort of like curves in certain ways and pinches and in certain ways. But that was my approach to this. It was thinking like, well, for all of these things, if I just start with a rectangle and I start to sort of bend and curve and pinch, and without even meaning it to, this became like a topology, an exercise in topology by someone who doesn't know anything about topology, but was trying to learn from first principles. Again, first principles sort of being like, I'm going to look at this. I know the basics of programming geometry. I'm going to try to figure it out. And so I went further and further, and it took weeks to get here. But then I was starting to get to this point where it's like, okay, I can have this bouquet. I can have this arrangement of flowers. I can start to approximate things that are starting to look like real flowers. Again, these are all just rectangles that I'm taking a rectangle and kind of pinching it at the corners to make something like a leaf, or pinching it and then curving it a little, or doing a swirl of rectangles to look like a rose. And these are all things that I was just intuiting, like this is a very intuitive process. There was some of it that was very technical. And once I sort of had the mental model of how I wanted it to work, I could make that happen. But I wasn't like reading literature at all on how other people have generated flowers. Of course, there's tons of literature on that from people who work in video games generating plants. I just wanted to figure it out, like how would I do it? Because that's how that's what's interesting for me in my creative process. I'm not very interested in seeing how did someone else do something and then duplicate that. I'm much more interested in doing it myself. And some people would call that reinventing the wheel. But like, I think it's an incredible way to learn new things, is by going through the process of kind of like figuring things out with first principles. And two, like, maybe the wheel's not that great. Maybe the wheel as it exists, like the wheel, early wheels were just like a log, and those were fine in some cases, but like we have better wheels now. We have tires on them. We have reinvented the wheel probably hundreds of times over the course of the last few thousand years. So like, yeah, it's fine to reinvent the wheel, and sometimes it's very good. And I think you will find a major difference if you look at some early cart that's just based on a rolling log, or even where it's a rolling log and you just put an object on top of it and roll it, and then look at, for example, an F1 car or something like that. Like, yes, we have reinvented the wheel, and it was good that we did that. And then I was also working on, some other context for these. So I started working more on making them a little more flower-like. I needed to create the artwork that would be the AR marker, and I wanted to use the flowers themselves. Also, this was a form of stress testing. Like, how many of these flowers can I actually draw before things break? Like, which is hard when you have to run something on a cell phone, right? Like, a cell phone is it's a pretty powerful computer these days, but if you're doing really complex real-time computer graphics, you want to run them at 30 frames or 60 frames a second, and you're trying to run this computer vision algorithm for AR, it was actually quite a lot of work to tune these in such a way that they would grow realistically. And then here's kind of where, I'm skipping lots of steps. I hope you can tell, like, there's lots of little slices, but here is where I've now jumped to the point where I have something that resembles the flowers that I'm trying to recreate. These are all flowers that are native to the Pacific Northwest. And I'm working on animating them. I'm working on having them react. But again, this is all still in a web browser. And so the third and missing piece of this, again, is the AR, right? This doesn't just exist in a web browser. This exists out in the world. And so very often, once I started having models, you can see I'm just using the marker from my own computer screen, which is a thing I do it's very common for me to do that. Just don't even print it. Don't even worry about having a physical object. Just show the AR marker, which maybe I haven't explained, but for the kind of AR tracking I'm doing here, you need an image to kind of kick off the process. You need an image that exists in the real world so that the software can start to make decisions about, like, okay, I see where this is. I now know where this image exists in the real physical world. And so I can start to attach the virtual flowers to it. And I'm sure once we get into the augmented storytelling phase of the institutes we're doing this summer, we'll talk a little more about that. And then I started getting more complex, iterating. The marker got a little more advanced. You see that big delay there? That was some software problems I had not yet solved as far as like the complexity, because I'm generating all of this. Every person who looks at this gets a different bouquet, different flowers. But I started getting more towards the bouquet. And again, this is still in the realm where I'm thinking, oh, I want to do a bouquet, right? This is before I've switched to the idea of like, oh, I should actually cover the dome. And then later on in the process, that moved into like, okay, now I've designed a real marker. I worked with Sean Light at High Order. He helped me out with the kind of fabrication of a magnet. So I designed this image. Sean helped me out with the printing of it, but this was the magnet that would go on the side of the dome. That would be that it's called a NFT marker. It's it's a different kind of NFT than maybe what you're used to in recent discourse. It means just natural feature tracking, meaning the software has some understanding of the nature of this image, and so it can identify it in space. And then finally, I'm at home just with these markers taped to my wall, basically in my apartment, doing stuff like this. This was a test marker, but yeah, I'm at home just testing this stuff, trying the colors, trying the lighting, trying the performance, trying to see what it looks like. And then I don't even have the videos included here, but I have just, I don't know, dozens and dozens of videos of this same process at the dome itself, of me just go and try a few things, take notes, do all the tests that I can, go home, iterate, come back to the dome. So as much as possible, I tried to test offline and figure this out. So I've already talked for an hour. I'm going to go just a little bit more just to introduce you to the project and then tell you that it is on GitHub. I'll have to make sure I actually did make it public, but just to introduce you to the project and how it was made. As I said, it uses 8th wall for the AR tracking. And so I have some pieces in here that are kind of responsible for that AR tracking part. And maybe at another time, I can do a bit more of an in-depth code walkthrough of this, but it honestly got pretty complicated. But there's the part of it that manages the AR experience. In fact, that's here. So this does stuff related to, okay, what is the camera seeing? How does the software, the 8th wall software, tell me where to put my work? So there's a portion of it that is only doing the AR work. There's a portion of it that is my little developer tools where I can, as you saw in those videos, I can grow my flowers, I can test. In fact, I probably just have, here's a version of that, of my little developer window. And in fact, I believe if you go to the Cultivate website, cultivate.j38.net, I believe if you go down here to developer mode and click generate, yes, you can see these are the actual tools I was using. They're very rudimentary. Probably not all of them even work because as I said, these were things I was testing and iterating on. Very often, part of the tools I would be working on here, but then I would also be making changes in the code, commenting things, uncommenting. You can see all these green blocks or things that I was like commenting, uncommenting. So that's the high level of the AR part is stored here. But the part that was more interesting to me and where things were a bit deeper was in the, let's see, where do I want to show that? Probably, I think in lib, yeah. So just to show you, and maybe this is where I'll stop because it's a pretty deep rabbit hole, but I just, I alluded to the idea of I'm creating these flowers as math, as rules. So I did just want to briefly show you like, what do one of these flowers look like when I'm working on it in terms of the code? And so let's just pick a trillium. It's simple. It only has three petals. And it's a relatively simple, nice white flower. You can see some of those probably. We can probably zoom into a trillium here. Yeah, so over here, we have some nice white trilliums. So this is the result. This really doesn't want to pan, does it? How's that? Okay. This little trillium is the result. Like this is what I end up in the end, or I can have it grow on a stem. But the actual code that goes into that is basically something I invented. I mean, that sounds really complicated or ambitious, but it was just like I wanted to create a sort of definition of what a flower looks like, or what the stamens and pistils, the reproductive parts of the plant look like, or what an individual stem looks like. And so this is kind of what this is the code that created that flower. And so you can see up here, this is trillium stamen. So I'm not sure that some of my botanical terminology, you'll have to forgive me, I probably got wrong, but you can see here in the center, there's the little sort of star pattern. It's low poly here. Of course, it's much more lush in real life, but I just wanted to describe an approximation of it. So I came up with this system for describing geometry, for basically describing as you draw a rectangle, I offer a number of transforms. And as I mentioned, maybe I like curve it, maybe I pinch it. So it's a lot to try to describe shortly, but you can see Oh, okay. Sorry, just getting a message from Nandini. Okay, that's great. I'll be done very shortly, and then we can talk, because this is a lot to go into, and so I won't go super deep into the code. But I do think it's bear pointing out that, you know, I could have modeled this in software, but I didn't want to. I wanted to try to create this generative system. So I invented this sort of little markup language. There's 6 little shoots in the middle that describe those 6 little yellow portions in the middle of the flower. There are, down here, you can see the definition for the petal, the trillium petal, where I have 3 shoots. And then I kind of have some math functions that describe what happens. And without going deeply into it, yeah, these terms are a bit complicated, but binormal offset, normal offset, path function, those all probably sound very complicated, but really I'm just doing 3 things. And maybe it's easier to point at as I do it. As I said, all of these really just start as rectangles. And all I'm saying is, as you go along and you're drawing that rectangle, maybe instead of just drawing it as a square, maybe pinch the ends. Right? So if I had a rectangle and I pinched the ends, what would it look like? Well, it would look quite a lot like this trillium, right? The petals of a trillium have almost that football shape, and you can make a football shape just by pinching the edge of the rectangle. Now, how do you get that nice curve on it? I think in this case, it might have just been a sine wave. In some of these cases, I just used a sine wave, you know, to describe mathematically how I would draw that. And sometimes I used, oh gosh, what was the tool? Let's see, web-based graphing tool. This is another thing where Nandini's definitely the expert. I think it was Desmos that I was using, where I could type in an equation. For example, you can always start with x equals y, and that just draws a line here, and it's very easy. But I could also do y equals something like the sine of x. And you can see, as soon as I start talking about sine waves, I get some nice curves. And hopefully it's obvious that if I took this little piece of this little line right here, right? This little piece, this little curve, and I did that both upwards and downwards. Let's see, how could I do that? I'm going to forget the math, and it's going to be embarrassing. It would probably be if I just offset this by pi, right? Yes. So if I offset this by pi, you can now see I've kind of drawn a little leaf. So this sort of looks like a leaf, right? That same principle also works. So I'm kind of doing that 2-dimensionally here. It also works in 3 dimensions, and actually any number of dimensions if you want to get crazy. But all I'm doing when I'm writing the code to draw that little trillium leaf is equations like this. And so in some cases, depending on the plant, you will see literally probably very close to that equation. Like in here for this black-eyed Susan, which I think are these cute little, I've lost it. The black-eyed Susans are, gosh, now I'm forgetting. I think they're these. It's only been a month and I've already forgotten which plants are which. I should pick a different one. The California poppy, I can definitely tell you about. So there's some equation in here, and without going into it, don't worry about the math of it, but you can see I'm calling math.sine. And in here for this, I'm calling math.sine because I wanted a curve that ran along, you know, to make the flower petal kind of curve. And I wanted to kind of pinch it at the ends. And I wanted to kind of, you know, not be totally flat. I also wanted it to kind of be able to pop up or down. The principle behind all of that really is just these kinds of simple equations. Some of them I got more, you know, some of them are a bit more complex. For example, I could say something that was like y equals x squared as an example. And you'll see that gives me sort of a different kind of curve. That the nature of this curve is different than a sine wave. And as you change the power here, you get really different things happen. Maybe like 8, something like that. And now you can start to see, actually, now I can start to get things that are a little more square on the edges. And if we go back and look at some of the flowers, you'll see I did exactly that. So I think these are called baby blue eyes. And you can see how the edges are a bit more squared off. In many cases, to get those squared off edges, what I was actually doing is just using some, whatever it is, some exponent to describe that curvature. So I might have gone to, in fact, let's just look. Let's see what my math was for a baby blue eyes, for the petals of a baby blue eye. It looks like, so it looks like I was using a sine wave for part of the curve. And for the first half, so this one's a little tricky actually, because this uses both. For the first half of the baby blue eyes, this part that pinches down into the center, I am using a sine wave. So for the first half, it's this, y equals x, or the sine of x. I'm using a sine wave for the first half of that baby blue eyes, but then you can see the second half of it, and you can see it both in the baby blue eyes, where the end of it is kind of squared. And then if we look back in the code, you can see I'm actually using kind of where I am. In this case, this would be the x in the equation to the 16th power. Is that the right way to put that? X to the 16th, let's say. And you can see that this gives a very square edge at the end, right? Like the edge is kind of squared off. And the baby blue eyes also has kind of a squared end. And I had, there's three kinds of equations happening at once. One is saying what you do as you go along the rectangle, so pinch or not. One is saying what do you do as you go along the width? And that can be, curving up or curving down. And what do you do as you address the height? And that one's a little more abstract, but you can see some of these kind of pinch, in another axis. So they're sort of folding in on themselves like this, this particular plant here. Actually, I think most of them have that. You can see it on this tulip too. There's kind of a folding happening. So I'm not just worried about going long ways. I'm not just worrying about the width. I also want to be able to kind of fold into what you might think of as the height. So I'm modulating at those details of the flowers as I move along them. And then of course, okay, yes, the musical part. So as I mentioned, I got basically to this point and was feeling pretty, actually, so this point visually, I should say. There was no interactivity on the flowers themselves. And I was pretty pleased with the look and I was pretty pleased with the feel. I was still tuning the flowers. I was still, I didn't even talk about sphere packing. Maybe I just want to show this because it was one of the most, let's say, mathematically intense, but also rewarding parts of this. I have to think for one moment where that would be so that I could show it, because I unfortunately didn't grab that image. Let's see, was that in? It should just take a second to see the sphere packing algorithm. And I'll explain what sphere packing is. You just have to see it. This might be, I think it's a wireframe material. Let's see. Okay, so I think it might be here. Here's the wireframe all in here. Okay, I think it's this block of code. We'll see. If this doesn't work, then we'll just we'll leave it for another day. But I think that might actually be where that equation is. Okay. Just to talk about this briefly, because this really was sort of like, I said I wanted to do everything from first principles and I wanted to figure out how to do everything from first principles. I've been kind of glossing over the idea of putting a bunch of flowers on a dome in a way that is like uniformly visually satisfying. It was actually a pretty complicated problem. It would probably have been less complicated if I just read somebody's paper about it or something and just used, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to figure it out. And so the way this actually works is not that I start with the dome geometry. So I showed you, let's see, I showed you this picture of the dome geometry. So like the very first version of this I did, you can see there's these points of intersection here, the vertices of this dome. The first thing I did was just kind of put flowers on those points. And that was okay. It looked okay, but they would like overlap a lot and it looked kind of bad. Then I started putting flowers kind of at random points, kind of in the middle, just sampling random points on the dome. And that was okay. But really, you would end up with these places where you'd have a really big flower or two big flowers like mushing into each other. And it kind of broke the magic of it because you'd end up with this kind of tangled mess of geometry of flowers just on top of each other. And because there was nothing in the code at that time to say, if I put a flower here, don't put another flower right here. So you'd have these terrible things where you have like a trillium on top of a rose on top of a baby blue eyes, and it was a mess and it just didn't look good. And so I talked to some people, I thought about it a lot, I don't know how to solve it. And so the solution that I went for was an algorithm. There's actually a series of algorithms, but the concept is sphere packing. So the idea is rather than just pick a bunch of random points on on the dome and just put my stuff on the dome, I would take those random points and then do a sphere packing algorithm, which basically means every flower gets its own sphere so they can never crash into each other. And that's what you're seeing here, is that every flower actually has kind of its own little invisible bounding sphere to make sure that it never crashes into anybody. And that sphere is actually doing two pieces. It's technically two spheres, but it's basically, there's two spheres. One of them, which is the bounding sphere just for the calculation, for the math to decide, hey, don't put these too close to each other. Let them stay apart a little bit. But it also, and this is a topic for another day, it's how I know that I can click the flower. Because technically you're not clicking the flowers, you're clicking the invisible spheres. So it is 11:14. I'm going to stop the presentation and bring Nandini on. And then while we do that, I will try to get it so that we can hear the music, because I'm not actually sure that we can hear anything here. So Nandini, if you want to jump back on, and then I will try to do the work to let it work in. Hello again.
Hello. This was amazing, and thank you so much, Scott. But I do want to see the music and
yeah. Okay, so just to confirm, you can't actually hear it currently, right?
No.
Okay, that's fine. So give me one moment. So you can start asking questions, and I just need a second to.
I wanted to mention two things about it before I ask you a question. One is, I hope everyone listening realizes it's all math, really, and you should.
Yes, it is. It is all math. Yes.
But it also talks about how to learn, whether it's math or code or something like this, that the process of making something that you're passionate about sort of encourages learning the thing you want to learn to make this possible. And I wanted to talk to you about that, about this, also this idea of doing some of these things and how you find these sources. There are a lot of places you can learn, and there are lots of things on the internet, but some aren't maybe better than the other. So when you decide, okay, I have to know this, how do you go about finding it?
Yeah, it's a little tricky. So as you mentioned, and if it's not clear, the way I learn is just by doing things. And so it always, almost always for me, it's very much like the cart before the horse, where it's sort of like, well, I want to make this, I don't know how. And so my process of learning is through just trying to do it. And so as far as like what the resources are for that, they're pretty varied. I would say one site that and actually I would say it kind of depends on what the problem I'm trying to solve is. So if it's like math or algorithms or something very software related, Stack Overflow is just sort of like the canonical place to go. I very rarely actually ask questions, because I find very often if it's some technical thing or something like that, somebody's already asked it and been answered it. So I will say I'm not just like a person that engages in like online forums and online communities. So for general generic support like that, and the first thing I look, I guess, is like, has anybody asked this question before? And part of that is a Google skill of like putting yourself in the mindset of like, how would people have asked about this problem? And so a lot of it starts with Googling. For very like technical software algorithms, will often end up in like the various sort of Stack Overflow kinds of sites. Sometimes there's just Stack Overflow sites that are about, in fact, maybe if I can, let me try to share this tab if I can. Let's see, maybe it will let me share a Chrome tab if I open a new Chrome browser. Because Stack Overflow is not just programming. There's also physicists talking. There's also mathematicians talking. I definitely went there to learn and read about sphere packing. I knew what it was and what the idea was enough to like know that it existed, but I definitely needed like, I needed to know more to do that. And so that's very common. I will say also a major resource that I use all the time is for the specific tools and technologies, whether it's Unity, whether it's 3JS, there's very often communities of people that are very focused on that. So 3JS is, it's an open source project. It's community built. And so their GitHub, they have their GitHub or their GitHub issues list is a good place to look. Unity has forums to join and look at. So much of my time spent early in a project figuring things out is actually just reading the documentation where there is documentation, reading sort of this like historical record of people that have had similar problems. Sometimes it'll be like, oh, somebody asked a question about this particular sphere packing algorithm in 2007, and just thank goodness that is still available or whatever. Like, so a lot of it comes from that. And then sometimes it comes from just talking to people that also work in that realm. And so, for example, with sphere packing specifically, I knew I was having problems with the placement of these. Like I was just having issues of the placement and overlap. And there are ways to do sphere packing that are like very slow and very iterative. For example, Dan Schiffman has some videos on it that it's amazing to see how he does it, but it's a process where you put one thing, you grow it, you put another, another. And I had to do this in like a 60th of a second. So I needed a very fast algorithm. And so I started with that approach. I started with going to Dan Schiffman's YouTube videos. He has a series called The Coding Train that's amazing. Which actually, if you're doing anything that involves physics or simulating code or anything like that, he's a great resource. But yeah, part of it is just using the internet and the people on the internet and recognizing there is almost this archaeological record from the last few decades of people that have had your problem. And part of the challenge is just finding those people that you have your problem. And also asking, like, again, for sphere packing, I had a slow way to do it. I talked to my business partner, David Lopser. He just happened to just weird synchronicity. He was working on another project that also involved flowers and also involved placing them in space. And so he was kind of talking about like, oh, well, thinking about sphere packing, it's just a conversation that we had. And so some of these things just come from conversations. And I think in that case, he used a totally different algorithm from mine, I believe. Or actually, maybe, I don't know, it might have been flattering because I think actually in the end, I might have showed him mine and he might have liked it more and used it. But anyway, sometimes those conversations happen, and it very well could have been that he might have just done it differently. Like he might not have even used sphere packing in the end, but it was enough of a kernel for me to go see. So I think conversations with people online and offline, and just kind of like, I think if you're a super beginner, it's good to try to identify a few people that are like, okay, that person knows what they're doing. For me, one of those people is Dan Schiffman. Like if you're just interested in code almost in any way of drawing things or interactivity, anything, and you're a beginner, Dan Schiffman's YouTube channel, just like go there right now and bookmark it because he's incredible. Sorry, I'm almost there, I think.
Yeah, thank you for sort of unpacking that, because to realize who are the people like you find out that are good resources, and sharing those is a really like useful, I think, thing for people starting out. You talked a lot about the pieces of algorithms, but there's also this connection of it is a very creative project, and it's an art project. It's not a technology project, and technology is just one of the tools. And I think people tend to separate these two quite a bit. So how do you talk, like, what would you recommend to, say, an artist or a technologist to say, what are the kind of creative, how do you come up with creative ideas that you think work really effectively, like knowing what's possible with what tools are out there, and same way for a technologist, like if they want to do something creative with their skills, what are sources that sort of tell you how to sort of blur these two things together?
I think obviously I'm a person that just wants to do everything by myself. And so anyone listening may be that kind of person where it's just like, I just want to figure it out and I want to learn. So I think one thing is recognizing the kind of what you're interested in, and that takes some time. Like maybe you actually aren't interested in the code part, but you are interested in like the visual art part, or maybe you're not interested in that part, you're interested in the music. And so part of that is just, I don't know how to recommend to do that other than just try a lot of things and see if you like them. So part of it is recognizing what you're interested in and being willing to explore in that. Part of it is once you kind of have at least a vague idea of a path to follow is, start to identify like what exists in that world, like who's making work. Twitter's a great resource for that. There's so many people that are making interesting things all the time, visual art, technology that you can kind of follow on Twitter. But I guess maybe the most important answer I have for that is that it's good for you to recognize like what you actually enjoy in it, because some people will only be interested in the technology part, right? Like they like the code, they want to do those technical problem solving. They don't just think of themselves as storytellers and they aren't as interested. But for every one person that is that person, there is another person that wants to tell the story that isn't going to do the technology. So part of it is definitely going to be combinations of people. For many of you, you may find that like, oh, there's just a part of it I'm interested in and I just need to find the other person. And I think that's one of the things we want to try to cultivate at SETI is like a group of people that are interested in both parts to put them together. And I will say in this kind of realm, in a lot of the realms I work in, for learning and starting, I'm a big believer. It's almost this kind of like Renaissance workshop model, or my understanding of Renaissance workshop. And the process, as I understood it, at least in some Renaissance workshops, was imitation, then emulation, and then sort of independent creativity. Meaning when you're just starting to learn, just copy. I mean, just like look at examples, get Dan Schiffman's code and play with it. Just the same way if I was going to tell you to learn to play the guitar, the thing I would tell you is like, pick a song that you like and learn to play that, because it's a little easier, both in terms of the technical part and the creative part. If you want to learn to play guitar, you're not going to sit down in one day and be like, I'm going to learn the physical mechanical part of this thing, which there's a physical dexterity thing to learn, and a music theory part to learn, and a like creative storytelling part to learn. You're not going to get all that at once. And so with guitar, for example, it's very common to say like, I'm just going to pick a song that somebody else already wrote, both in terms of the composition and musicality and the music theory behind it, and in terms of the creative story that they're telling. And I'm just going to worry about getting my fingers where my fingers can move. And so kind of the maker equivalent of that, I generally think, I mean, I don't know, I don't use the term maker. I think of myself as an artist, but it's very common in sort of the maker world to go to Instructables or go to Adafruit's tutorials, and just, somebody will have made a thing and they'll be like, hey, here's exactly what you need to make this. And then you can worry about honing one part of the skills while somebody else has solved the other problems, right? If you're learning to solder, you shouldn't also be trying to learn how to design a circuit and do like make a musical keyboard, or you know what I mean? Like it's sometimes a little easier if you just build on the things that are there. So yeah, the summary of that is definitely be willing to start, just like emulate, copy, take code, play with it, mess with it. Sorry, imitate. Then emulate, meaning like, okay, Dan Schiffman did this thing, but I kind of want to do this thing. So I'm going to tweak it and do my own thing with a little bit. And then finally, you'll be to the point where you can do your own work. So that's a process that has worked for me. I've seen that work for other people. Obviously, different people learn in different ways, but I really like that progression of start out just by look what's out there and kind of copy it. Okay, I'm going to do a quick experiment.
I'm going to do one last. There've been a bunch of things in the chat that I'm really excited about your work.
Oh, okay, sure.
And so I want to leave you know, sort of two questions, maybe one. One is, you're going to be teaching workshops in the SETI Institute, and are you going to do a little bit of this and help unpack some of this? Or what are you going to do so that people can come and learn from you? We'll stream some of them, but some of them are very hands-on.
Yeah.
And then the last real question is, what are you what is your like crazy idea experiment that you're mentally mulling? Every time you're like doing these talks or teaching or making, what is your next big sort of thing you'd like to play with?
Yeah. So, so as far as the Institutes in the coming weeks, so we're still in sort of our Enchanted objects block of that. So yesterday I did an introduction with sensors. I talked about, if you didn't catch that video or catch the talk, you can go watch the video on YouTube, where I talked about a lot of my work that has used sensors. And the point isn't the sensor, right? The point is that humans can come up and this thing that I make can know about what they're doing, or something can be going on in the world. And so I think hopefully there's some useful content in that talk about not just the technology of the sensors, but sort of like, what can you do with them creatively? And hopefully like, what can you do with something as simple as a button if you kind of are clever about how you present that button? And then the plan on Monday is to go a bit deeper into that. And so we will be taking, I'll be talking about a number of microcontrollers, which my desk is always perpetually covered in. So here we have an Arduino here hooked to something. This one, I don't even know what this microcontroller is, some kind of Node MCU. I have a Circuit Playground Express here. We're going to start unpacking this. We're going to start talking about, we talked about the sensors, like where the data comes in. So you could think my eyes, my ears, my nose. Now we're going to talk about the brain of in this analogy. And so in this case, there's a tiny little chip on here. And in this case, there's a fatter chip right here. And we're going to talk a little bit about how do you start to bring the information in, create software or create, visual structures that reason about that in a very simple way, and then do something fun with it, do something interesting with it. So maybe I can, it's hard to even get into it because there's so many possibilities, but just how can we take this little device, the sensors that are on this device, get some information into it, and then have something fun come out, whether it's light or sound or whatever. We're going to figure it out. And so Monday is going to be partially me talking and then partially totally hands-on. And we're going to kind of just set everybody free to just play and make some of these kinds of things. The second question is a little more tricky. I think I always have 100 projects kind of moving around that are kind of software projects, or a lot of things I work with on different clients or in different groups. I've been doing a lot of AR lately. And so that is something also that will be coming up quite a bit in the coming weeks. Kind of the middle part of the institutes will have a bit more of a focus on AR and AR storytelling. We'll look a bit more at some of the technologies like I used here, some of the other technologies that I was angry about earlier. And towards the end, we'll kind of shift focus a little more specifically to interactive murals. Those of you who saw the stream yesterday, I've done a fair amount of work in that realm. And so we'll try to make one. We'll try to make a simple, won't be crazy ambitious to start with, but hopefully it will be the foundation of something more ambitious. And for my own work and what I'm doing there, I have some ideas for weird interactive objects. I'm interested in making some robots that have one sense, and that is a certain phobia that they're afraid of. So they will just be little robots that know nothing other than to be afraid. I have a very silly musical chair that I will be bringing into the lab that I've been working on very slowly, that has been sitting in Sean's shop for a long time. But basically you sit in a chair and you spin in the chair, and as you spin, it will play music. I have some other sort of like interactive digital frame kinds of things. So always a lot of projects, but always at the core of it is hopefully some physical element that humans can like move and use their bodies, and hopefully not just like sit and move nothing but their thumb and their eyes. I'll just jump through and talk extremely quickly about the sounds, because yeah, it honestly, Nandini's right. That's the part that when you were actually there was the magical part. And I've kind of glossed over it a little bit just because there's so much to talk about. But I use a package called Tone.js, and I created some software. So I'm also a musician and work in sound a lot. And so I created some kind of dreamy sort of singing samples for the flowers to sing as you tap them. And so hopefully you'll be able to hear that. Is that audible? Yes, it is. Okay. So the question, and again, this was kind of a decision. Okay, great. Thank you, Max. Limited time at the end, but I did want to add that idea again of like, I'm creating something good, both for these flowers, but metaphorically in the community. I can tap one of these flowers, it'll sing a little tone, and that'll propagate out. And I initially thought like, oh, maybe the individual flowers will be their own tone and you can play a little song, but this is that observing kids play a thing. Kids just want to hit everything and tap everything simultaneously. So instead, I just made it where it will kind of do a little generative song, so you don't actually have to try to compose things. So even if you click the same flower and over again, they'll sing a little song together. So you can play with this. This is my weird little developer review. At some point, hopefully, it may not be until the fall, I would like to have some time to like wrap up this part of the project a little more, like the ongoing documentation. I should actually check. I believe I put all this in GitHub. It's definitely not meant to be, I should say, it's not meant to be like a example project or something that you could just clone and use, but it could be something that is useful to, I'll put a link here to it on GitHub. It could be something useful to just see how something like this is made, but I'm going to say it's probably not the best example if you're just getting started. So I will play this now, and hopefully you can all hear it. And that's, I mean, I should say, I want to call out Aisha Gursaz, who is the videographer that shot a lot of that footage. And I think, just maybe the closing thought I have on this is like these moments in here where you see people that are smiling and enjoying it, like that's the payoff for me. Like I enjoy solving the problems, but it could be pretty stressful. This was a pretty short timeline, but the thing that makes it worth it, and especially I don't think we actually got video of him, but he was super adorable. There's Nandini, remember there was that one super cute kid that was just kind of overwhelmed with it to the point that he gave me a hug. It was just super, it was so sweet. It was lovely. And it was lovely to see people come out and enjoy it and have this opportunity to play with something like that in Pioneer Square.
Thank you so much, Scott. And for those of you listening, Scott is going to be teaching a series of workshops, but also sort of playing with this philosophy of art as being sort of participatory and being out in the world and not in sort of galleries, but it's something people create through experiments and accidental ideas they get from talking to other people. So come and join the conversation. Come take workshops. You'll meet lots of people like Scott. And thank you all. We have our next talk tomorrow morning at 10:30, where the amazing Imanye from Carnegie Mellon is going to be talking about paper and craft and time and makes beautiful, beautiful sort of physical objects. So same YouTube channel. We'll see you then. Thank you.
Great. And I will remove us in the unceremonious StreamYard way. Thanks, everybody.